On a Monday, we like to check in with the Australian Christian Lobby. Wendy Francis is the ACL National Director of Politics. Wendy's back with us. Wendy, always good to talk. Welcome back to 2020.
Thank you so much, Neil. It feels like it's been a few times that other people have been able to speak to you and not me, so I'm glad it's me this time.
Well, I'm always glad when it is you, although it is wonderful to know that there is such a depth at the Australian Christian Lobby, and you've got state leaders in different states and territories and different responsibilities, and the breadth has grown dramatically, and the depth and the maturity is just amazing. So, but always good to talk to you, Wendy.
You.
Hey, let's start with The Voice. The dust is starting to settle. There's still all sorts of debate going on, although the war between Israel and Hamas does sort of take some oxygen out of discussion around The Voice. What are your overall impressions as things begin to settle on The Voice?
Well, I think, very clearly, overwhelmingly, Australians voted down the government's concept on The Voice. But I think as the dust has settled, as you say, more and more people are saying, let's use this as a catalyst for discovering what our Indigenous people in Australia really need. What do the communities actually need, the Aboriginal communities? And, we're looking at things like, health facilities, safe drinking water. Christians often, and my husband and I are involved in this as well, we often support projects that are happening overseas in Cambodia or places like that communities don't have safe drinking water, and yet here in our own nation we have communities that don't have safe drinking water. So these are the areas that I think people are starting to say those hundreds of millions of dollars that were spent on the recent referendum, where can we actually match that and start spending it exactly where it needs to be? So the idea of an audit, I think, is sounding really positive to me. I don't think anybody should be afraid of an audit. Let's look at and see exactly where all the money is being spent, and how can we do things better.
It's amazing, isn't it, that while there was almost a year-long debate going on over The Voice in the referendum campaign, we feel like resolving the gap problems were somehow or other on hold while the debate was on. And it's as though the government had no real plan B and could have been working on those simultaneously. But what you're saying now is an audit is a way to get a fresh start to look at all of the issues that were raised during the debate.
I think so, and let's look at all of the trails of money that go for Indigenous projects, and let's slash any that aren't working and boost the ones that are, because there are some very good projects that are happening, but there is also, it would appear, that there is an awful lot of wasted money that is not actually getting to where it's needed. And so let's do this. Let's get behind this, an audit of all the money that's being spent. It's not a try and get you sort of thing. It's not a trying to attack anybody or trying to find out where people are not doing well. What we really want is to see, where is the money going? How can we use it better? Because there are real issues in community that need to be addressed. And, we've sort of wasted a lot of time, I think, and we do want to listen to the Indigenous people on the ground where they are in community. We can do that without having this big referendum.
Wendy, throw you in the deep end here because in some sense there is a obvious fact that so many of the Aboriginal community in Australia, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, in fact, somewhere in the vicinity of 6 in 10 are Christian Aboriginal people. And some will argue that somehow or other the Christian voice was not as loud as it should have been during the mainstream voice debate. Is there something here, and I'm not sure whether you've got any plans as the Australian Christian Lobby, but just to maybe help to bolster how that Christian Aboriginal voice can be heard? Is there any connections there? Are you working on any sort of initiatives around that type of focus?
We are actually working with people of faith in the Aboriginal community, and as you say, it is a majority. And, what I find most upsetting and quite a colonial sort of concept is, you hear people saying, well, the Christian faith is a Western ideal and, you shouldn't be putting it onto Aboriginal people. We have so much we can learn from our Aboriginal people in terms of faith in God. And the Christian faith is not a Western ideal. And how colonial is it to think that we can actually talk people into becoming Christians? No, their faith is very real and often in really difficult circumstances. And they have, the Christian Indigenous people, Christian Aboriginals, have such an understanding of forgiveness because there is things that need to be forgiven. But like all of us have things in our life that we need to forgive. We can learn so much from the Aboriginal Christians. And so, yes, we are working with a number of Christians in community, but also in suburbs dotted right around Australia.
All right. Well, of course, Christianity is not a Western idea. In fact, it comes from Israel. I mean, what we've got here is Jesus was a Jew. So there's something very Eastern, Middle Eastern about our faith and the faith of those Aboriginal people we're talking about. But while we're moving towards talking about Israel, a nice little transition to that conversation. Wendy Francis, let's talk about Israel. Of course, the war is deepening. The ground assault hasn't begun yet. The misinformation, though, is being perpetuated far and wide. Any thoughts here from the Australian Christian lobby on the misinformation being perpetuated?
So the truth is definitely being skewed. And my concern is that people that I talk to are now getting confused as to what to believe. And I don't think that we can escape the basic fact here. The basic fact is that Hamas is a terrorist organisation. What they want to do is to wipe out Israel. That's their aim. Hamas is a terrorist organisation. The evils that they have perpetuated on people are unspeakable. They are literally unspeakable. And so then the violence that is actually being whipped up in Australia in support, really, of what Hamas have done is also diabolical. And so, whether or not, I'm not one who would say that Israel has not done anything wrong and Israel is completely faultless in past skirmishes and things. I'm not going to say that. But what I am going to say very clearly is that this was not something that was caused by Israel. This was Hamas, a terrorist organisation that have done unspeakable things to innocent citizens, innocent people, and it must be that truth must still stay first and foremost in people's minds. And so these rallies in Australia where people are calling out horrendous anti-Semitic chants. This should be shut down. This should be shut down.
There's lots more to talk about on this topic as we continue our conversation on 2020 today, and the Reverend Dr. Mark Jury is going to be my guest after our conversation, Wendy Francis, and no doubt we'll get into a lot of these sorts of dimensions of what's happening with the war just ahead. Let's talk euthanasia in the Northern Territory. They've announced that they're looking to reintroduce euthanasia. Thoughts here?
Well, all around Australia, so in every state now we have euthanasia laws, and in every state we can see the devastation that they're bringing. And so our plea with the Northern Territory, particularly with the high number of Indigenous people who live in the Northern Territory and who do not support euthanasia, who are the most likely in Australia to actually take their lives through suicide. So this Northern Territory is particularly a concern for us. But if you look around every state in Australia, we've got bad laws are about to be passed in New South Wales. They don't come into force until the end of November. But New South Wales, just about 2 weeks ago, they reallocated $150 million of palliative care funds towards the implementation of that. So they've slashed palliative care funds from a state that is already completely underfunded for palliative care. We've got in Queensland Parliament, we've now had the first report of euthanasia in Queensland having been taken up since the beginning of this year when it first was introduced. We've had more than one person a day in Queensland take their lives through euthanasia. Then we've got, an elderly man who actually took a VAD medication that was prescribed for his terminally ill wife. So she died naturally, and her euthanasia medication was there, and he took that medication without having any terminal illness at all. He was supposed to return it apparently within 14 days, but instead he took it. Now this is what's happened in Queensland as well. Devastating stuff.
We've got many things can go wrong, can't they? And even as you're sharing, back to the New South Wales government reallocating $150 million of palliative care funds towards implementation of VAD laws, in my mind, that strikes of scandal. I mean, and when you start to tell the stories of what's going on as those initial reports are coming out of Queensland, it's almost as though we are now witnessing the implementation of a culture of death. We've had a culture of life, preserving life. Now there is a change and almost a culture of death that's obvious here. Any thoughts around that? Because when we talk about, some big picture issues and how culture changes, this is one of those big changes, isn't it?
It is a culture of death. In New South Wales, his funding was cut, and so he chose to end his life because his NDIS funding was cut. Often this sort of culture of death, Neil, comes down to the big dollar. And so what priorities are we putting on life when we're actually looking at the dollar amount? So, it's a lot cheaper to end somebody's life through a medication than to give them beautiful and loving care to ensure that they are comfortable in the end times of their life. So we are actually developing, and it's a callousness. And, in this day and age as well, we've got a rising elder abuse problem. And, when we're looking at elder abuse and the implementation of euthanasia, you can see the devastation that can happen there. We've got state attorney generals pushing for VAD prescriptions to be available online by telehealth. Now, it's not hard to imagine the problem with that when you've got somebody online saying that, yes, they want to end their lives through euthanasia and they want help to do it, and you have no idea of the pressure that's being put on them to say that. But this is just a complete turnaround in any care for human beings and human life in our country, and it's devastating.
We might all be contemplating where all this might be headed because even as you tell those stories, they're just illustrations of going from bad to worse. And as I understand it, in the ACT, they're even discussing allowing children to choose to end their own lives. That would be another development, wouldn't it, on the spiral downwards?
Correct. I mean, we talk about a slippery slope. The ACT are not caring about a slippery slope. They're going straight there. So they're discussing allowing children to end their lives. They're also discussing allowing people who are not terminally ill to end their lives. There's a patient at the moment there was an ABC report of Kath Dyson. She was talking about whether or not euthanasia would be available for her by the time she wanted to end her life. And in the ABC report, she's quoted as saying, well, I guess it comes down to suicide one way or another. I'll either take my own life or somebody else will end it for me. Either way, it's suicide. So there's not even any pretense anymore that this is anything other than state-sanctioned suicide.
It's a way of saying suicide is good, and that's challenging when you are a Christian believer, knowing that we are created with value in the image and likeness of God. Hey, of course, where this seems to have all started was with all of the relaxation in Australia around the issues of abortion. And we've got these horrendous abortion laws here in Australia. And, of course, that's led to this moving towards the voluntary assisted dying euthanasia issue. But come back to abortion for a few moments, because I know there's a glimmer of light or two on the horizon so far as the Born Alive bill. What are the likely possibilities of that bill being heard or even voted on in the federal parliament? Thoughts from you?
Look, it's still alive. I use that term, born alive, and that the bill is still actually alive. Because what happened was that when Matt Canavan, Alex Antic and Ralph Gordette, the senators who introduced this bill, when they introduced it, the Senate moved it off to a Senate committee, and that Senate committee was meant to come with a recommendation. At the end of a very long inquiry, that committee decided that they could make no recommendation. So they have made no recommendation either way. What we're seeing now around the different states is in New South Wales and South Australia and also in Queensland, there is a recognition that this is happening. So we've broken through that barrier because there was a barrier of people saying it just doesn't happen, it just doesn't happen. In those three states, we now have recommendations from their health departments saying that it does happen. So we know it does happen. And so what Matt Canavan is making clear that he wants to do is to reintroduce the Born Alive bill. So it would be unlikely for the Senate to say, oh, well, we'll send it off to a committee, because they've already done that and the committee couldn't come up with any recommendation. So what is the Senate going to do with it when he reintroduces it? Well, they can either choose just to ignore it and leave it on the table, or they can actually give it a fair hearing and debate it. Now, either way, it's still keeping this alive. And so we're so grateful to Senators Canavan, Antic and Babette, but we're also so grateful to the thousands around Australia who have actually really taken this to heart and talked to their MPs about it, because there's no doubt that has made a difference in this case.
So you've got members and senators who are prepared to stand up and get involved in the battle to save lives. That's with those babies born alive. Because we're almost out of time here, Wendy, to reflect on the effort that it takes to actually turn around the sort of legislation that we're seeing so prevalent now on a whole lot of different dimensions here in Australia. Obviously, all honour to the good work that you do there at the Australian Christian Lobby, but it's people who actually support the ACL that make those things happen. I wonder if you've got a reflection on the sort of effort that it is going to take to actually be heard and turn around some of this legislation.
It's a massive amount of effort and it's an awful lot of time. And the average Australian who has a job or a family, they're not set aside to do this work. So ACL, people like Cherish Life as well, we have a great relationship with Cherish Life, we're set aside to do this work. And it is a massive effort, but people have got to remember Wilberforce. How long did it take him? Decades to turn around the slavery issue, and yet it had happened in the end. And we are witnessing a pro-life generation rising up. I'm absolutely convinced about that, Neil. And you just have to look to the United States and see we now have some states in the United States who are banning abortion. So this is an incredible turnaround, but it has happened after decades of work, but also a massive amount of prayer. People have prayed into this, and that's what I would encourage people to do now, to really pray that God will work in our nation, pray that we will be turned back to care for every single life in our nation. But then, of course, we want you to get activated as well. It's one thing to pray. We also want people to get active and really support these campaigns. Yeah.
Well, when we hear these sorts of things we've heard today, we recognise there is a submersion into a culture of death in Australia. If there's going to be any turnaround, it's going to take enormous effort, and it might take a long time, but you've got to start somewhere. Let me encourage listeners today to visit the ACL website and become informed about some of the legislation and some of the initiatives that are going on right now, acl.org.au. No doubt, Wendy Francis, there's still opportunity for people to be a part of the standing army, the people, the mums and dads in electorates all over the country who are prepared to roll up their sleeves and get involved with some of the ACL initiatives, and no doubt there's some more of those to come very soon too. But acl.org.au, and Wendy Francis is ACL National Director of Politics. Wendy, thank you so much for another update today on 2020.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you all for listening.